everybody, and welcome once again to Reverb. My name is Alex Helberg, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host and co-producer, Calvin Pollock. How you doing, Calvin?
Doing good, Alex. How about you?
Oh, I'm doing fantastic, especially today because we are joined by Dr. Charles Athanasopoulos, an assistant professor of African American and African Studies in English at The Ohio State University. His research interests lie at the nexus of Black rhetorics, media, and culture, and his first book, Black Iconoclasm, Public Symbols, Racial Progress, and Post-Ferguson America, was released in September of 2024. We are really excited to have Charles here to discuss this work. So, Charles, welcome to Reverb.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I'm really honored to be invited and I'm excited for the conversation.
This book is really fantastic, I have to say. It's probably the most fun that I've had reading a rhetoric book in a while. Just like the style, the sort of conceptual elegance of its argument is really, really captivating. So I'm really excited to get into talking about this with you. So I wanted to just kind of open up with a question, start at the beginning. The introduction of your book begins with this really provocative reflection on iconography. That's the kind of key central thread that runs all the way through your work, and the role of representation in both visual and cultural rhetorics. You've got this particularly provocative comparison between Leonardo da Vinci's historical icon of St. John the Baptist and Kehinde Wiley's contemporary reframing of St. John the Baptist as a black man, or as multiple black men as part of his series. Can you tell us, what is the significance of this painting? What significance did it hold for you? And why did you choose it as the framing device for your concept of Black iconoclasm more broadly?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question and thank you for the kind words. I really appreciate it. So, the project kind of thinks about, I would say, four major questions, and then I can sort of tell you how those questions came about. So, how does Black iconoclasm unsettle discourses of racial progress in post-Ferguson America? And how does Black iconoclasm dismantle the iconic narrative surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement? So, this was me trying to think as a rhetorician about the context in which I exist and give BLM its full treatment, right, as a rhetorical artifact. From there, what use does the language of iconography and iconoclasm have for theories of Black study? And then how does Black studies disorder traditional approaches to iconoclasm in communication, anthropology, art history, and the study of religions? So I think this project really began for me from a really early age in unconscious ways. So being Afro-Puerto Rican and Greek Roma, I grew up really heavily involved in the Greek Orthodox Church. Not that I took any special roles on or anything, but it was always very present in my life. And I did go to a parochial school for a number of years that was right next to a Greek Orthodox church. And the curriculum, hey, you want to talk about educational indoctrination?
Yeah. The parts that
Um,
you write about that in your book are pretty wild, I have to say. There's some
yeah,
really interesting anecdotes about that education in your book for sure.
yeah. And so I just remember from an early age when I would walk into this Orthodox church and they sort of have the dome structure to them. Everywhere that I would look, it would be like these vivid depictions of like Jesus in the desert and being tempted, right? Or John the Baptist, right? Or something like that. And it's a particular kind of language, right? The style in which these paintings are done. And they reflected to me the values, the sort of God and devil terms, right, of the Christian religion. And there's a point where I came to realize that religious iconography was not strictly religious, that was also racial, it was also cultural. And that is sort of the point where I start to, so as part of this parochial school, I go to a forced mandatory confession. We had like mandatory religion classes, the like Greek cultural indoctrination classes, pretty much. And in this mandatory confession, I guess I was feeling particularly petty that day, and I just kind of looked at the priest and I was like, "Listen, like I don't really have faith in this God that you want me to have faith in." My life is saturated with all of this violence, and I can't really see a sovereign being that can justify that. Which, is like, that's not really my position now. I am like a practicing Buddhist, but I had that kind of moment of discourse in my life. And I looked at him and I was like, I don't know why I should be praising some like white man who decided to be a hermit and like in a monastery as some saints when there's, working class Afro Puerto Rican and Greek women like my mother who, she's working three jobs, I'm watching her stifle her hunger, ought to give me an opportunity in life to be the first one neither of my parents finished high school. And so I basically made the argument that this woman who had a child out of wedlock, right, who doesn't fit sort of racial or respectable codes of this Greek Orthodox culture, to him that's blasphemy. And all right, so there was a sharp break for me from the Christian religion. So when I went to college, I wanted to think about race and colonialism, but there was no Black studies at Wake Forest University. There was no ethnic studies at Wake Forest University, not as a major, not as a minor. That only happened after I graduated. And mind you, I went to college 2014 through 2018. And go Deeks and all that, but like now they have a Black studies program, and it's wonderful to see that. But I found myself, one of my friends, Joe LeDuc, he was in religious studies, and he told me like, hey, you should maybe think this through, because they had a reputation for teaching about race and colonialism and gender. So like I paradoxically end up in a department for the study of religion, right? So I took really cool classes like on Buddhism. We took one on the Dead Sea Scrolls and like reading like Jewish peshers and like commentaries, right? I took like First People's traditions, and my advisor was thinking about whiteness as a religion, right? So I took classes like Capitalism, Color, and Charisma, Uncle Tom's and Black Messiahs, right? So I was thinking around these religious concepts and race, and I'm also minoring in writing. I'm also on the debate team, which sort of paid for college, which are usually housed in comm programs, right? A past life, don't hold me to it.
Yeah, we are
No judgment here.
we're a writing studies podcast. No com on this podcast. Just kidding. Just kidding.
Great.
Yeah.
And in the backdrop of all of this is the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement as I'm in high school. Like Michael Brown dies right before I get to college. And I see Baltimore in 2015, right? All of these things are Alicia Garza comes to campus. So I see the birth of BLM. I see the like fervent backlash and suppression. I see its re-intensification and subsequent adoption by the mainstream. I'm thinking about all of this, right? And so this is where the concept of Black iconoclasm really comes about. The prologue really performs this idea of undisciplining, of I'm not going to be bound to any strict purist definition of a discipline or methodologies. I'm going to engage in a kind of Black method that Lou Mirage calls Black intercontextual reading. So I'm going to read seemingly disparate contexts together to show you how they're all connected by this conceptual iconography. So, for Mirage, he thinks about a BLM protest, a song that comments on BLM, and a BLM syllabus connecting the seemingly disparate cultural arenas of pedagogy, pop culture, right, and social activism. And similarly, I'm really thinking across in this prologue, personal experience in schooling and with a religious community. I'm connecting that to portraiture, like actual art. I'm thinking about the political context of BLM, right? And all of those sort of come together. And so I start with Kehinde Wiley because that portrait sort of shows you that the religious iconography around Saint John the Baptist, who's a Messiah, who's an angel, who's a demon, is tied to cultural symbols, right? And so within American culture, perhaps the Western world, blackness is seen as a sort of devil figure, whiteness as a God figure, right? So whiteness is seen as pure and sacred. This is why the majority of depictions of Jesus Christ are actually like the son of the Borgia Pope, right? Cesare Borgia. And so Kehinde Wiley is messing with this language of iconography, right? The particular gold leaf style. And he's mixing that with European portraiture, an entire other sort of vocabulary. And then he's also pulling on the vocabulary, the racial iconography of America, right? To say, look at these Black urban men, we can view them as these saintly figures, right? And so it shows that's the first thing that it connects. But the thing that it also shows us then is what I start to comment on, which is the limits of simply trying to move from a negative representation to a positive one, right? So with the priest, I feel very righteous in saying my mom is a saint, right? From negative to a positive, right? You're not a welfare queen. You're not this Jezebel. You are a saint. Kehinde Wiley says, look, we can figure these black men as St. John the Baptist, as messianic, as sacred. I also comment in a political context on the renaming of the Bronxdale houses to the Sotomayor houses, right? The first woman of color Supreme Court justice, right? And instead of lamenting the continued existence of the project, she's happy that her name is on them, right? And so in each of them, there's a limit to simply changing the content of an icon, but maintaining the form of it. And so an icon then is the particular public symbol, but it's attached to a larger conceptual value system that I'm calling a racial iconography. And so that's why the Wiley piece is interesting, because it literally it's taking a traditional white representation of divinity from Da Vinci and trying to like disorder it through blackness, but it maintains the very same terms, right? And so this then allows me to start to endeavor to reframe Black iconoclasm away from the traditional renderings of iconoclasm.
Yeah, I think it's so brilliant, particularly in that prologue or introduction where you're naming all these acts of transgression that you yourself are doing and also ones that you're reading. But you're also, I mean, really careful not to settle on lionizing an act of transgression as its own sort of like, we do the transgression and then it's done and then it's settled, right? And now we've got, like you said, this new positive symbol in its place. This is where I think your notion of the twilight of the icons that comes up, a kind of playful homage, or at least a call back to Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols, as this liminal space where the potential for both iconoclasm and the creation of new icons exists. Can you elaborate on why the concept of a twilight as your kind of metaphor at the center of this book, and how it relates to Black social movement rhetoric and the challenges, or perhaps even the trappings, of thinking about achieving lasting social change?
Yeah, yeah. And so I think this sort of perfectly lines up with thinking about the reframing of Black iconoclasm. And so, I'll be honest, Fritz, Nietzsche, he was like my first intellectual love. When things were rough at home and I wanted to escape, I would take like buses and trains to sit at a Barnes and Nobles and like read Thus Spake Zarathustra. Like that's just straight facts. Like you go ask my mom that right
You didn't
now.
think about like
I
comic
mean?
books or video games as a kid.
For some,
You were a very smart
right?
kid.
I don't. Maybe just a nerd. I didn't understand what was happening in the book at the time, but I tried. And so Nietzsche has always been this thinker that influenced me. Of course, I came to problematize some aspects of his thinking, but generally, for me, Twilight of the Idols is sort of an anti-Western modernity book, right? It says, like, I'm over this nationalism. I'm over this facade that you call Western modernity. I'm tired of this Socratic discourse of rationality and like mutual recognition that isn't actually real. And he's sort of like subbing the predominance of like Hegelian thought in German philosophy, right? Where you could argue that he's doing that, right? So he's really trying to reject that the sort of epistemological certainty that Western Europe has about itself, this sort of arrogance and how it sort of moves away from what makes living great, right? And so for him, the Twilight of the Idols marks this space of transition, right? And you don't really know if you're preparing for dusk or dawn. You don't know if it's the end or the beginning of something. You're just in this space of transition. And in that space, he argues that we can have a revaluation of all values, right? Where sort of there's an inventiveness to life rather than a formulaic replication of these decaying standards, right? Now, I don't mess with his whole like notion of the Ubermensch, which has a sort of its own sort of epistemological arrogance to it, and which is why I sort of adjust him through Fanon. And this is also sort of distinguishes why I say icons versus idols. So for me, idols really assumes an epistemological arrogance of like, I know the true thing. I have the true worship of the God, or I have a rational secularist perspective, and you worship this like foo-foo thing over there that's not real, that you ascribe powers to. And this to me is rooted in the colonial discourse of like the Portuguese assigning the concept of fetish to the religious practices in West Africa. And so for me, but Fanon to me is very Nietzschean. Nietzsche has a huge influence for him in my mind. Not to say that he's reduced to that, but I see this common thread. So in the opening of Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon says, "Don't expect any explosion today. It's too early or too late." And for me, I think that he's positioning us as practitioners of Black study, as those interested in undoing the status quo, as in this twilight between an anti-Black and colonial world, a world full of statues, a world that is too sure of itself, and what might potentially lie beyond it. But he's unsure of what comes beyond it, and he's unsure if he's situated in the correct moment for that thing to occur, right? And so for me, that vantage point, that liminal vantage point, challenges traditional understandings of iconoclasm prevalent in communication, religious studies, art history, and anthropology, where the iconoclast is usually either a religious zealot who believes that, so there's a couple ways, but the religious understanding is like you cannot represent God, right? And all of your representations become replacements for that God, even though you think you're worshiping that God, you're actually venerating this other object, right? So there's the famous clash in Orthodoxy about this, and the Orthodoxy went the other way in Christianity, which thus why Orthodox churches are like so filled with iconography. The other way that this is understood is the European secularist that thinks that visual culture is the decay and that we should remain within the rational scripto cultures, right? And so for them, they're like both of these are about controlling the public thought, right? And so because of that, you get thinkers like Michael Taussig, you get Bruno Latour, you get all these different thinkers who sort of frame iconoclasm as inherently paradoxical, inherently always producing another icon. And I take their concern seriously. I just don't think that it's inherent to what I'm thinking of as Black iconoclasm. And so when I talk about this liminal perspective, I'm also influenced by ritual theory. So there's Victor Turner thinking about liminal populations that exceed static categories, and James Carey saying that we can't think of communication as just transmitting information neutrally, but it's rhetorically staging a kind of drama, a nod to Burke and man as a symbol using animal, right? But it's actually a sort of a ritual that is staged. And Nietzsche himself thinks of ritual transgression, right? To break apart the staticness of Western culture. And so that's how I'm thinking of Black iconoclasm as this sort of process of inhabiting disorder, of throwing things into crisis, of being suspended without things to cling to. And in that space, right, we can think about our harmful attachments to Western man, but we also can experiment with various alternative ways of being without producing a formula necessarily of what that thing is. And that for me is where Fanon becomes pretty important, this concept of tabula rasa, scraping clean the tablet. But for me, that's not like a thing you achieve in a future. It's a process of Black radical discernment. You're constantly putting into crisis not just what the white world says, but what we have established as the commandments of Black liberation. So.
Yeah, I mean, you really did an amazing job, I think, just generally in your argument of really kind of unsettling, as you said, kind of the Western man conception of, all transgression having a sort of teleological endpoint to it, but also, like you said, that kind of interplay with existing Black theorists as well. I just wanted to offer one little quote to our readers here, just because I thought this like little paragraph was like such an amazing summation of kind of the project of the book, where you write, "To begin with the premise that this book doesn't offer a definitive answer on Black liberation is to begin with the premise that none of us got the answer. To admit that we exist in the twilight, to admit that it is hard to distinguish iconoclasm from iconography is a necessary mode of humility in how we approach Black liberation. Rather than a spectacular moment of destruction, Black iconoclasm is more like weathered cracks in white pavement, like that split second when you're suspended in the air after lifting your feet off the security of a diving board. What would it mean to let go? Not only of the perverse violence of the anti-Black world, but also the rigid model of spectacular Black resistance we cling so desperately to in response. What would it look like to instead commit to Black resistance as a lifelong, messy, non-linear process inevitably riddled with failures?" And I mean, just the kind of intellectual humility that it takes to finesse an approach like that, I think is really refreshing to read. So anyway, I appreciate the way that you set up this framework. It's something that is very particular to the argument that you're making here, but it's also a stance that feels like it needs to be adapted in more other kinds of directions. Do you know what I mean?
Well, and yeah, and thank you for reading that. And in fact, it kind of offers me the opportunity to say that part of this is religious for me in the sense that I think the separation between the religious and the secular is false. And so I approach Black liberation and Black study as a kind of religious commitment. And part of what I'm saying here is that we should approach Black study as a kind of negative theology, one that refuses to assert teleological blueprints of Black liberation. We don't know what that world looks like. It exceeds our capacity. Now, we can think about negative theology in the Abrahamic tradition, but I'm really thinking of this from a Buddhist perspective, particularly the Madhyamaka school and Zen Buddhism, which really my religion teaches me that generally we exist in a cycle of suffering, samsara, right? It's because of ignorance, aversion, and attachment, right? And that the goal is to escape that cycle by relinquishing our attachments. And that's what we call nirvana, right? Nirvana is not enlightenment, it actually means to extinguish the self. And the metaphor that is used is blowing away the leaves of a dandelion, right? Until it disperses into a larger ecology. And that's really why I am trying to approach it in terms of like it is a continually lived thing. And one of the things that we learn as, and I'm just a lay practitioner, like I'm not like, I'm not like vetted and all that, I do my little thing. But one of the things that stood out to me is this phrase, when you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha, right? So if anybody has the sort of the arrogance of proclaiming to have found the answer to everything, you already know that you have a problem. And so that to me is part of the shift away even from traditional readings of Black liberation theology, as I mentioned, with thinkers like Vincent Lloyd, who are like important thinkers and influential to me in many ways, but there's sort of this push to like there is a Black sovereign God judging the white world. And I'm just like, that's not really anything that I'm ever trying to claim. I don't really have that belief in a sovereign being like that, but also I would never claim the epistemological certainty of judgment in that way and what that perhaps mimics about Western man, even as it changes like God from white to Black, you know what I mean? And so really part of what I explore is like in some ways, the negation, the relinquishing of something, the refusal of something, as we see in Buddhism, and I think this is argued in Black studies, generates opportunities for something else that is not strictly defined.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is a really fascinating philosophical approach to these questions and conceptual approach. I will be honest, I'm at the point where I want to talk about examples, and your book has incredible examples in it that you go through, case studies. And I think that I know that for Alex and I, the timing was very similar for us to you with how Black Lives Matter shaped our political consciousness. Like for me, I was starting my PhD program when Michael Brown was shot, when Eric Garner was killed. And the protests were massive in Pittsburgh. It was a huge part of how a lot of young people in the Pittsburgh area came to political awakening, and we were really shaped by those events. And you bring this concept of iconoclasm, Black iconoclasm, to the BLM movement in a really powerful way. In chapter 2 of your book, you perform what you call an iconoclastic genealogy, exploring some of the moments of rupture, co-optation, and contingency within the history of BLM, including some of the more contemporary critiques of the Black Lives Matter global network. We just wanted to give you a platform to talk through some of the tensions and possibilities that you saw within the BLM movement when you were analyzing it in the book.
Yeah, and I'm glad that we're, as we shift to these examples, is sort of part of what I'll preface this with is for me, as I say in the project, I don't want anybody to think that there's a strict methodology to Black iconoclasm. I imagine that 1,000 people read it and have 1,000 different interpretations. And I love that. I love the chaotic trajectories of that and the different ways that they'll use it. And so each of the chapters actually perform different manifestations of Black iconoclasm that mobilize different sort of language or metaphors as they approach the particular rhetorical context, right? And so that's sort of one of the major importances of the rhetoric degree for me. That training was really thinking about the full context of something, whereas in my undergraduate training, I felt like I was putting structural theory for 80% of the time, right? And then 20% contextualization. It was like, no, how do I start from here, right? So this chapter is a great example of this in the sense that chapter two, right, in the Embers of Black Critique, it mobilizes this language, right? The embers of Black critique. It's using this notion of a fire that is in a transition point. It is embers can be snuffed out or they could be reignited, right? And in fact, different portions of the embers could have different responses, right? And so portions can exist while portions are extinguished, right? And so for me, I'm thinking about this language. It requires almost to imagine BLM's iconoclasm as this fiery thing, this thing that is undoing and threatening to engulf, right? The burning house metaphor that was prevalent in the Black Power era, for example. And so BLM is this iconoclastic thing, and it gives me this language, right? As I said, I grew up in this Orthodox church, and so the language of colorblindness and post-racialism was the majority of my upbringing, and it's only towards the end of high school and the beginning of college that this sort of the prevalence of multicultural co-option really starts to rear its head or re-intensify. And so when BLM is happening, it's like, wow, it's giving me a vocabulary to understand like this is the problem. And this is the problem with the Obama administration, even though he's Black, right? And so Alicia Garza comes to campus and I'm really excited. I'm like literally in my first year dorm, like, when I talk about seeing Confederate flags, it was like my dorm, a shared bathroom, another dorm. If the door was open, like they had a huge Confederate flag in 2014, right? So it's all really pressing. Bree Newsome takes down the South Carolina Confederate flag, and so both of them show up, and I'm like, I'm excited. I knew Melissa Harris Perry as the undergrad, like kind of here and there, and so she's like, go to this event. So I'm going there, and I'm really excited. But as the time goes on in my undergraduate career, I start to hear all of these criticisms of BLM and Alicia Garza, and like at first, I'm really defensive about it, and then I start to really question what's going on. I start to feel defeated when I start to let those critiques in. And that's just sort of what spurred this chapter is that reflection. And so the iconoclastic genealogy is like, well, why don't I consider those fracture points, right? Those moments where the embers are ignited and those moments where they threaten to be extinguished. And so I'm thinking with this Audre Lorde poem, Who Said It Was Simple? And she has this phrase like, which me will survive all these liberations, right? And so this is what I'm thinking about, like through all these iterations of Black Lives Matter, like what survives? Which Black lives are forefronted? Which Black Lives Matter are we getting, right? And so that is the thing, the sort of mantra that I go back to as I analyze these fractures and I'm holding us in that liminal position. And so I begin to chart out like, here are all the generative iconoclastic things about the original iteration of post-Ferguson before it was ever called BLM, right? When BLM becomes this on the ground thing that pushes past the civil rights model of organizing, that centers the most marginalized within Black communities in this sort of intersectional way, right? It seems to retain this sort of anti-capitalist tinge to it in its early iteration. And then we start to hear, well, there's a sort of dispute over who founds it, right? And it's in that dispute over who actually owns the moniker that the push to legitimate oneself as the Black Lives Matter is actually the thing that threatens to suffocate the movement, right? So like a Garza is responding in the history of Black Lives Matter to these people saying that they started BLM and how that erases, sort of the foundations of the movement. And on face, like understood, like they're doing something that's messed up. But thinking with Black feminist thinker Jennifer Nash, this posture of rhetorical defensiveness has its issues with it. And she's applying this to intersectionality, and there's a whole debate about that, right? But I'm applying it here to say that defensiveness about the moniker of BLM basically leads to a collapsing of perspectives where any criticism of the global network and the founders are said to be feeding the conservative backlash. And so it actually promotes this sort of like almost like Marxist tanky, like close ranks, you can't question me, comrade, because the evil capitalist enemy. And it's like, no, like that's not what's happening here. That's fascist. So and similarly it's like there are all these intra BLM criticisms of the founders, Garza, of con colors in particular, the misuse of funds, right, lack of transparency, organizational shifts. Fundamentally BLM is owned by nonprofit boards by 2016, right? I chart it. The documents are in the chapter. You can chart it for yourself and through these documents. So what ends up happening is you have the BLM 10, they split off. You have BLM Cincinnati, they split off. They call themselves Mass Action for Black Liberation now. BLM Grassroots is a split off, but then the global network tried to make it their own thing, shut that side down, and then their own internal thing has a beef and a whole lawsuit going on, right? And so I start to look at all of these disputes, and what it shows us, right, is that there is this iconic narrative of BLM that has sort of staticized what this iteration of the Black liberation movement could be, and we need to dismantle that to open up back those flows, right? But that doesn't mean that any of these groups on their own responding to the global network has the answer, right? So this is kind of all to my argument that it's not a neat cycle. There are multiple iconoclastic trajectories responding to the Obama administration and all of these things, right? That coalesces into what we call the umbrella of BLM. There are multiple iterations of BLM, right? One of the more iconographic ones, sanitized, moderated ones, becomes the icon of it, right? But there are other elements that exist, so it's not a one-to-one. Those other elements start to critique the global network, right? And let's just say, even if they were to dismantle the global network, it's like, well, BLM 10, they're kind of ambivalent. Like they're like, we'll use the term, but unless like it comes to the point where we can't use the term, right? Mass Action for Black Liberation is like, we're done with the term. BLM Grassroots is like, no, we're the real BLM. So they all have different postures, even though they are iconoclastic toward the global network. So again, there's always multiple threads of iconoclastic and iconographic possibilities in every moment. And particularly in this activist moment, right? So when I first wrote about BLM, the first piece I ever wrote in my second semester of grad school was smashing the icon of BLM. And in that one, I was sort of saying, look, it was iconoclastic and now it's become an icon. And while I'm proud of the piece now and having really teased out what I think about Black iconoclasm and BLM, it's hard to render that judgment at all because BLM is not a unified thing. Neither is generally the post-Ferguson era. And so the point is that in this lens of reading, we can begin to discern like, here are the things that worked for us. Here are the things that aren't working for us. Here were the pitfalls of this particular maneuver, even though like understood why you did it, right? And that can help us produce a kind of, so this is where Black iconoclasm shows up as something that actually is of pragmatic use to people in activist organizations on the street that they can take up and actually create a critical process of reflection in the moment, right? It's not a one-off diagnostic. It's not a DEI training. It is a constant thing built into the ethic to say, we don't all have, I don't have the answers. Garza doesn't have the answers. We can't have that model, right? We can't fall in love with our own image. No.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is such a rich reading of the entire, period, the post-Ferguson period to now. It makes me think about the sort of broader way in which BLM or like 2020 even has become this kind of negative conservative ideograph to talk about like the 2020 summer 2020 Black Lives Matter protests and defund the police, right? The ways in which it has morphed into a kind of villain devil term, which is a concept that you use in the book as well, for both the kind of centrist Democratic Party that wants to expunge Black radicalism from any sort of liberal side of the political spectrum, and a conservative side that wants to like tar the entire liberal side with that brush. I wonder if you have any thoughts on some of those later echoes.
Yeah, so when I wrote Smashing the Icon of BLM, I'm writing at a time where the co-option of BLM is not exactly fully occurred yet. So as I'm writing and thinking about the piece, people are telling me that I'm tripping, like actually. Like multiple people are telling me like, nah, this is wrong. Like this is not gonna bear out. And I'm like, all right, we'll see, right? So what I think is happening, these conservatives are right for the wrong reason in the sense that in 2014, in 2015, in 2016, the centrist Democrat was not necessarily saying Black Lives Matter. Like I remember like BLM is like staging like interruptions at like Clinton and Sanders rallies
Yep.
at this time, right? And the idea of all lives matter versus BLM is still like a prickly issue for Democrats. Fast forward to like, Nancy Pelosi kneeling in kente cloth, and Mitt Romney is saying that Black Lives Matter, a guy who was part of a church that until 1978 did not allow black people, right? Like,
Right.
he was in his 30s, right? So it's not like he was 10, right? So, there is a shift that happens. There is a real shift where, the NBA is like, we peep what happened with the NFL. We're not going to make that mistake. We're going to put Black Lives Matter on the court. We're gonna let you say your piece. We're gonna let you link arms. We're gonna support the diversity initiatives and the Spotify playlist.
The black squares on Instagram.
Right, right. Like I remember in 2018 and 2019 being like, what is happening? Like I was sitting there like, all of a sudden, I play like NBA 2K25 or Madden, right? And now it has end racism on the back of the helmets. And in 2K for the NBA game, there's a police officer, but also you can buy BLM gear. It's all free to like fit your players in. And it's just like, that is not what it used to be like. And so I think the later echoes of BLM for conservatives and centrists is the moments where the rest of the world went crazy in their mind, right? They were like, there were always these far left radicals, but now all of a sudden, all of it is mainstream. It's shoved down our throats. It's in even the engineering space, right? It's not just in the particular like section of the library in the humanities. And it's also a response to the Obama era, right? It's like first black president. Oh, they're still not happy. So if they're not going to be happy and we weren't happy, we're going for Trump, right? Like it's not a coincidence that that's the follow-up to Obama, right? And honestly, he would have won that second term, in my opinion, if it wouldn't have been for that very end COVID crisis stuff. Like that, I think that was the particular thing that people were like, God messed that up. You know what I mean? So I think, yeah, there's something that happened where the suppression and co-option tactics of the late 60s have been finessed, they've been refined, like there's a black identity extremist watch group now, just as there was COINTELPRO, but the finesse is different. And the idea, the stronghold of white liberalism and gradualism to make abolitionism seem irrational is stronger than ever. And it has, in some sense, enabled the normalization of right-wing discourse as more centrist than the far left. So yeah, I think that and especially with like we can literally point to the issues with the global network's existence. And so I think, yeah, playing on those terms, hitching BLM's like wagon to the Democratic Party for Biden, for Harris, those concessions are what get us here.
I mean, there's so much here. I think one of the ways that I'm seeing a through line is just iconoclasm as a need to destroy icons, even as you construct new ones or build on old ones and kind of generate these new transformations. And relatedly, you have a case study about the Black Lives Matter mural in downtown Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh is near and dear to Alex and my hearts. We did our PhDs there. I'm from Pittsburgh. So we did want to ask you about this because I think it kind of materially instantiates a lot of what you're talking about. You draw from Edouard Glissant's concept of a poetics of visual relation when you're analyzing the BLM mural in Pittsburgh. And we just wanted to know if you could give our listeners some more context for where the mural is in Pittsburgh, what it looks like, some of the details of its design and subsequent transformations. And you also you analyzed desecrations of it and desecrations of similar murals, and also just how your experience of this mural fit into your experience of the 2020 BLM protests that happened in Pittsburgh surrounding the killing of Antoine Rose and other victims of police brutality in the Pittsburgh area.
Yeah, so for me, this chapter again mobilizes another set of language or another extended metaphor that dislodges this idea of icons and iconoclasm in a neat cycle, right? So rather than icon and iconoclasm in a neat dialectic, for me, Glissant's poetics of relation means that there's actually this tripartite process that is constantly unfolding, right? Going back to what I said about there's always iconographic and iconoclastic possibilities in every instance. For him, there's totality, the like desire for transparency and systematicity. There is chaos, right? The sort of like disordered trajectories, they're erratic, you cannot predict them, and then the echoes between them. And those three things are for him, they're present in everything in this conversation, in political movements, literally everything, right? And so this graffiti wall turned mural is a perfect example of why there isn't this neat cycle, why there are all of these possibilities and risks all the time. And it's really a microcosm of the things that I've already said about the Black Lives Matter movement, right? So I'm in grad school at the time, I'm working on a dissertation. I've taken a visual rhetorics course with one of my committee members, Caitlin F. Bruce, and she tells me about the existence of this mural. Later on, right? Originally, I was at the BLM protests, the particularly large ones. I think there was like one particular guy who was like this white dude who got arrested for like burning a cop car. I was like literally maybe like 10 to 15 feet away from the guy. Like I
Oh
could
my
see
God.
right by PPG Arena, I think it
I
was at
remember
the
that. Yeah.
and I don't like, I was just like, I don't know. I looked over, I was like, I don't know what this man is doing, but
That's
like,
Questionable.
I was
wild.
like, and it's not like, I just didn't see any like tactical thing happening. But point is, I was at this protest that I think was probably like the largest one, and it like starts near the downtown area. We pass through the cultural arena district, we pass through all of these areas, and like everyone's there, like kids, but everyone, some of the more radical leaders, like Neek, rest in peace, who was found mysteriously dead and was one of the leaders, and we actually had like people who were trained and armed to protect protesters. So I'm at this protest, and there's all of these things happening around me. There's people doing stump speeches on political reform, civil rights style. There's people just yelling at each other. There's people like Neek, who's trying to organize people towards black radical politics. There's Pittsburgh, I Can't Breathe. You see the like white communists come out, but then there's the like tankies, then there's the anarchists. They don't talk to each other, right? So it's like you see all of this around you. And then there's also the police, right, who are starting to throw tear gas. They're starting to kettle people. Like there are literally like cops, like equestrian police, like they're on horseback, and people like it's a very chaotic scene, right? It is Glissant's chaos mon, chaos world, right? But there are possibilities, like some of the discourse there is not all equal, it's not all great, but this is still a moment of possibility, just as it comes with risks. And the mural the graffiti wall originally was an echo of that protest that I was at. So I'm at that protest and I was like, cool, went to it. I went to a couple of others. I start seeing murals popping up by this Target, right? At one point, literally the National Guard is pointing rifles at us as protesters at one of these rallies. But I'm starting to see murals pop up. I'm writing the dissertation. I'm in Bloomfield, so I'm seeing like the Irish Cafe has all lives matter, all counts, all equal. I literally lived across the street from this Trump guy who literally had a revenge tour thing going on. Like, so it's like you see the symbolism everywhere, and then I find out about this particular one. So as I understand it, originally it was just like this mural of like Pittsburgh flora. It was just like a muralist made, like an homage to like Pittsburgh like greenery basically. And so what happens though is an echo of this protest, this group of mostly white graffiti artists, as I understand it, there's maybe like one black person. I think there's one black person involved, but generally the black community is not really invited to participate. But what they do is they dress up as construction workers and pretend to be doing a project, and they actually ask permission from the muralist. Interesting. But they go and put over Black Lives Matter in this typewriter font that is red and white and very bulky. And it's sort of just plastered across the wall, right? Legally done. And then the city is mad about it. People are mad about it. And they're like the mayor, I think it was Bill Peduto at the time or something like
It's
Yeah.
that.
Bill
probably
Peduto.
probably probably Bike Lane Bill back at that point. Yep.
Yeah. And he's like, we're gonna power hose it off, like we're gonna power wash it off. And so then there's this huge conflict, and then the city decides not to power wash it off, right? So it's chaotic in that sense. It's an echo, right? It's an echo of the BLM protest, but there's some totality involved, right? The overwhelming whiteness of the graffiti community, this sort of notion of paternalism or saviorism that when they were asked, why didn't you involve black people? Their response is like, because y'all were more likely to get arrested and we wanted to protect you. And it's like bullshit, right? You don't get to determine that, right? But so within this iteration, chaos echoes in totality for just this one group in this first iteration. And, and so and that's to leave aside perhaps the like what we could say about the original graffiti wall. So the original graffiti wall, as I understand it, also has the face portraits, right? Of like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Antoine Rose, and I think Ahmaud Arbery, sorry. And so you could sort of make arguments about the content of it as well. There's also that visual preface that I talk about that's in the original graffiti wall. That's like, this is not art, this is not graffiti, it's a political statement, it's to be digested. It's like free the real, say their names, right? So you can make arguments about like the preface itself, it's chaotic, it has echoes of BLM, but it also asserts a gender binary, which could be totality. It makes this division between art and politics. We could problematize that. So the content and the actual actors have all elements of relation, right? Well, then Camo and Wavy Wednesday, who are life partners and art partners, they're the ones who lead a sort of collection of muralists to respond to the white guerrilla graffiti artists, and they just start to like literally annotate and redact different portions as a political statement, right? Which to me is performing what Christina Sharp says about Black redaction annotation is a practice of seeing beyond the like visual culture of the plantation system, basically, right? So they start to add little comic book figures and they actually put a snake through it. And to me, the snake, at least in this context, is like y'all are snakes, right? And so that starts to happen. And eventually they negotiate, like, no, we're going to take stewardship of this mural. And they put black roller paint and literally black out all former portions of the original iteration of the graffiti wall. But it now turns into a mural, right? Because graffiti generally is either defined by its illegalness, which is disputed. So Dr. Bruce has a project on this, for example. Or you could think about the way that it is aerosol based in particular. So I know like Dr. Bruce thinks about the aerosol based and then the community practices around it as defining it, right? But those three things are generally used, but they're using like roller paint, right? They're not connected to the graffiti community because interestingly, the muralist community is more black. The graffiti community in Pittsburgh is more white, yet the muralists are much more into the like neoliberal co-option, like we'll take money from the city and do these projects and help support these bills and take the money from the same legislatures that criminalize graffiti as felonies. So there's this interesting complexity there of totality on both sides of that, right? So the redactions and the annotations are chaotic. They have echoes from the protests. They're echoes of the original graffiti wall. Well, they're also echoes of Black Pittsburgh community, right? That's why it was a flowy black and yellow typeset, which of course is the reference to me, at least, to Wiz Khalifa's black and yellow, Pittsburgh Steelers. It's sort of like the colors of Black Pittsburgh. I know there's like literally a hip hop underground tradition. There's that song called Clipsburg, if I remember correctly. That's all about the hood, right? Thinking about Homewood and the Hill District, right? So it's echoes of that as well. And but of course there's totality. So actually part of what happens is that Camo and Wavy Wednesday take a deal to be the artists in residence. They take a deal from the city and the Office of Public Arts, and they start to shoot a documentary narrating the official history of the mural. It becomes part of like the River Walk on the Allegheny. So it's part of literally like the cultural arts district, like official touring of the city, right? And they start to change the political messages around it in part because there's also the desecration. So like some guys like donning Confederate flag sweaters, like shoot it up with balls. Somebody writes thug over Antoine Rose, which that wasn't necessarily in the chapter, but that happens. But it's also there's also like genitalia is put over George Floyd's face. Someone puts like a dollar sign and free B money like over Breonna's face. So there's all these different desecrations with perhaps distinct motivations, some of them like a white backlash, right? The traditional white iconoclast, in fact. And so they start to change the mural where like the major like BLM on the back like disappears and it's just like portraits of various black people from Pittsburgh, political or not. So like you got Billy Porter, you got local high school teachers, CEOs, NBA players, Wiz Khalifa. He puts like a gold chain there to represent like the Cuban link, right? It's like a play on slavery and chains. And so he reframes it the Black Flowers Project so that it's not political. It's just a neutral celebration of Black life. And the only place where you see Black Lives Matter is like now behind the column with the preface. But like everything else, like you still see the portraits of, but like when someone is walking by now, they don't necessarily know off rip, especially if you don't like BLM, who those people are, right? So like people are like, they're like chilling there. People are on like boats and they're drinking. Then there's PNC Park, right? Like, so it's like the average like Pittsburgh citizen and tourist goes through there, and now it's sort of not as political, right? But I center on each iteration like these random spots where it just marks moments of transition, which to me again is that twilight, which is to say it is still unfinished. As much as the city and Camo and whoever wants to claim stewardship, there's always the possibility of other iconoclastic challenges, just as there's the opportunity for further co-option, just like with BLM. And real quick, I'll just note there's interesting history around the location, right? So that area generally is at the site of multiple forts. And particularly, I think one of those forts was the first site where European settlers gave smallpox infested blankets to native warriors. It is, I sort of mentioned, kind of like, not that there was a particular slave ship that went through there, but seeing these like docked ship chain links by the mural on the columns and kind of thinking about then situating Pittsburgh as this site of making the United States with the 7 Year War, with, the context of colonialism and enslavement. It then also becomes the Chinatown, which then all these discourses circulate about like the dirty Asian migrant, right? Interestingly, this area is called the Golden Triangle, which is also like I don't know if that's what they mean by this, but there's an area in Southeast Asia that is referred to as that. And but then at some point in the making of the Avenues of the America and to section off the downtown and the cultural district, the cultural arena district, they completely destroy that Chinatown, and so that it's a pretty much white only space. And the way that they make the highway actually is still partly responsible for this sort of segregation of the Hill District from these major areas where you have to take like two buses, right? Like transfer to get there, even though it's a shorter distance than like the Strip District or like Bloomfield area, right? Like it still is actually harder to get there. So, and then it's of course then the murals in this background of these highways. Highways themselves are sort of part of this larger white flight history across the United States, right? So all of that sort of context shows you this flow of relation with all of these trajectories around it.
Yeah. It's a really perfect, I think, representation of, yeah, like the Chaos Mon, like you mentioned from Glissant, the resistance of that totality in all of these different historical states that this mural went through. I mean, I remember specifically, like, I mean, I lived not just in Bloomfield, but up in Troy Hill for a few years as well, where I was coming down the hill, biking along that riverfront and seeing that mural from the north side looking south and seeing all the changes that it went through over that time was, I had no idea of that history. And so not only does it serve as a really useful instantiation of what you're theoretically trying to show here, but it's also just a really interesting material history to read in and of itself. But I think we wanted to move over to Personally, one of my favorite chapters, which is chapter 4 on Fanonian slips, which is this clever concept that you developed in distinction to the notion of a Freudian slip, this quasi pop psychoanalytic term for when somebody accidentally relays the subtext or obscured meaning of what they're saying out loud. You talk about Fanonian slips in the context of, probably the craziest one to ever do it, Joe Biden, in the way that he specifically, the examples early on in that chapter of him distinguishing, poor kids can be just as talented as white kids.
We have this notion that somehow if you're poor, you cannot do it. Poor kids are just as bright and just as talented as white kids, wealthy kids, black kids. Asian kids.
And then, of course, his infamous interview with Charlemagne the God, where he tells the interviewer, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
Listen, you got to come see us when you come to New York, VP Biden.
I will.
It's a long way until November. We got more questions.
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, and you ain't black.
So can you explain to our listeners how examples like these exemplify a Fanonian slip? What does that concept mean? What are its implications then for the way that we use language and iconography in relation to race?
Yeah, so for me, a Fanonian slip really are rhetorical slippages that emerge accidentally amidst the attempt to soothe racial tensions, right? And so in psychoanalysis, there's the symbolic, imaginary, and real, right? The symbolic is sort of the structure of an equation, right? And then the imaginary are the particular values that you input into that equation. And then the real is sort of the moment when the equation reveals itself to be inadequate to express whatever is going on, right? And so I'm imagining this in terms of language. There's a subfield of rhetoricians like Callum Matheson, Josh Gunn, Ichabrolu, who are doing work around this, right? And so for psychoanalysts, right, language is the attempt at mutual recognition, right? Remember, language is a filter. It's not neutral or objective. Symbols are arbitrary representations of things, right? And we can manipulate symbols. We know this as rhetoricians, right? So language is the attempt at mutual recognition, but it's one that is never fully achieved. It's never quite a one-to-one between the supposed self and other for psychoanalysts, right? But there's always this attempt. It's kind of like a parabola, right? It never quite actually meets. But for Fanon, who I want to note is writing about psychoanalysis before Lacan, is actually doing his own thing, kind of basing it in response to Freud, is really thinking about, and Spillers as well, right, is thinking about psychoanalysis. Race is a construct that has a social and political utility to securitize white and non-black ego. And ego, like ego, means self in Greek, quite literally, right? By saying like, hey, there's something which can never really even access the basics of this thing that we call subjecthood, even if our subjecthood isn't like really like fully what we want it to be. Right. And so blackness actually securitizes that white being, but it also becomes a source of anxiety about slipping into the conditions of those beings. Right. So that's why blackness is seen as a phobogenic object, right? A fear inducing object for Fanon. Right. And so Fanon in the Black Men and Language, sort of the first chapter of Black Skin, White Mask, he says that to learn a language is to take on the cultural taxonomy, the ways of being of a particular culture. And he sort of teases out even on the basis of language and accents, how Caribbean Martinicans try to assimilate themselves to the French Empire, right? And this happens to Black people across whether it's Hispanophone, Anglophone, whatever it is, right? And so there's that. So I want to actually position Fanon as a rhetorician. He's not beholden to any discipline, right? I think Fanon and Spillers are rhetoricians. They are interested in language and culture and the self and racial symbols, right? And then so when he's thinking about psychoanalysis, he says that, right, if for Lacan, there's a mirror phase, right, where the as Callum would say in class, the wee baby, right, the wee baby says, I am X, right, and their caregiver says, yes, you are, right? And they distinguish themselves from the other, right? For Fanon, when the black child looks in the mirror, what they see is a white concept of self that actually cannot be authorized. So it's not that the white self is fully authorized, but it's literally to like look in the mirror and you cannot see yourself. You see a version of yourself rendered through the white mask, right? And it has deep implications for your image of self, your image of other black people, how you approach life on every register of your life. And Spillers is having us to think about the sort of guilt that you acquire after you realize this, right? And also she adds more of a feminist sort of thinking about gender in ways that Fanon himself cannot think of that I talk about in the chapter, right? And so Spillers then allows us to think about what she calls the interior intersubjective, this relationship between the way you form yourself, the way you form community, the way you form an idea of culture. And she brings us back to this idea of language, right? And so this distinction will matter for the examples, right? There's Énoncé, the statement that you actually make, enunciation, like the process of forming a statement. So every process of forming a statement is an attempt at mutual recognition, right? And then it's an attempt to enter into the symbolic, right? But the particular thing that you say is the imaginary. It is the combination of symbols that you string together to enter into that symbolic economy. And the slippages are those moments, right, where, oh, the equation doesn't fit. It reveals something is wrong, right? That's where the slippage occurs. And so in this example, in the Biden examples, right, well, let's think about the first one. He's giving a speech at the Asian and Latino Coalition. He's trying to frame himself as a progressive candidate, right? So before he says anything, we know why he's there to speak, right? Some mutual recognition between him and his like people of color constituents. And then the particular thing he's trying to say is like, we need to have sort of diverse educational opportunities. We need to not have a one size fits all for our students. Like, we have to meet them according to their social context. And in the middle of doing that, he accidentally announces that when he thinks of poor kids, he thinks of people of color. When he thinks of rich kids, he thinks of white kids. And Fanon, of course, says, you're rich because you're white because you're rich, right? The cause is the consequence. He says that in The Wretched of the Earth, right? So it was almost too perfect. And so you can see there's the general perspective of the white mask, that symbolic economy, trying to say there's mutual recognition, right? And then the slippage emerges. But that one was linguistic, and I started with that one because it was linguistic, because it is closer to a Freudian slip. But it's not just a linguistic slip. It's not saying the wrong word. It's the actual rhetorical message and the contradictions that emerge within it. And that's why the example of Biden saying, you ain't black, it's not like he said the wrong word. Right. What he's trying to say is like, I will fight for you in ways that Trump won't fight for you. Right. He's going to destroy like aspects of the black community and these other people of color. And like, as concerned citizens who vote, like you as black people should like, it's a clear choice. It shouldn't be hard. But that's not how he said it. He basically announces that he kind of thinks like, well, black people vote Democrat. The NAACP is the arbiter of the black opinion. They've endorsed me. And so your political ideology and your race are conflated, right, from these essentialist perspectives, right? And in doing so, almost launches a kind of like authenticity test of one's racial blackness, which really colludes with the sort of like only the black moderate liberal perspective is like actually a black perspective because the other ones are like romanticized or somehow not black enough, right? Which is similar to the Hillary Clinton, like I keep hot sauce in my bag. Like,
I was just
hey,
going to bring
no,
that
you
example
don't.
up. Yeah.
What's something that you always carry with you?
Hot sauce.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Are you getting information right now?
Hot sauce.
Hot sauce in my bag, swag?
Hot sauce.
Really?
Yes.
Now listen, I
yes.
just want you to know, people are going to see this and say, okay, she's pandering to black people again.
Okay. Is it working?
It's like, no, you don't. Like, and if you do, like, we all know it's like Frank's Red Hot. It ain't no real hot sauce, right? Like, but also it's just like, she couldn't help herself because her whole point is to be there to pander. And so when Charlemagne the God is like, people are going to say you're pandering, all she can say is it working? Because it's almost like a hee hee, like
Yeah.
had some staffer or like her daughter or granddaughter was like listening to Beyonce and she heard the hot sauce reference. And in that moment, she was like, hot sauce. And they were like, huh? Really? Right. But again, all of these are still, I don't want to give the impression that Fenonian slips are simply like white people trying to pander to black people and thus slippage. It's like really the whole point of a Fenonian slip is that endemic to Western subjectivity and communication are these slippages. So from to the extent that black people and other people of color try to integrate themselves into the white mass to legitimate themselves, these slippages will happen. Even when you think you're doing the pro-black thing and that you think this is the authentic black culture, in many instances you find in analyzing Fenonian slips that this is still an image of blackness rendered from the white mask. And that's where I think Killer Mike, where he has a shirt where it says like kill your masters, but he's at a police press conference with the mayor. He's telling people to stop protesting, right? And all these slippages emerge basically between who's the master, who's the slave, what does it mean to kill? Or, there's the examples that I give with the judge in my last name, right? So these are examples of black people, of people of color who even in their earnest desire to enable survival or be pragmatic or whatever, we see the residues of Western man. Yeah.
Yeah, you already went through a lot of examples from that chapter. I was curious if you would want to reflect at all on what happened outside a wine bar in Pittsburgh, because I thought that story was incredibly revealing. It
Yeah.
really captures, I don't want to say bizarre because it is such a, in a way, such a banal example. It's the kind of thing that happens in all American cities all the time. But to me, it captured something about like the awkwardness of Pittsburgh racial politics. So I don't know if you want to share that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And so, by the way, the wine bar in question is called Spill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That place is great. I used to go there like all the time and like order a pizza from Caliente or Angelo's. Like when I left, I went and said bye to that couple. They're a lovely couple. They actually
That's
gave us
wonderful.
a bottle on the way out. It's a cool place. So, actually, I was thinking about this and I'll actually start with something that just happened recently where I went to this like art exhibit that was about like abolition from formerly incarcerated artists, and I show up and I'm like dressed nicely and all that, like not super nice, but as I'm like trying to get a drink at the bar there to like walk through the exhibit, I kind of just got this sense that like the like white women behind the counter like were assuming that I was one of the formerly incarcerated artists. And it sort of is just like it kind of reminds you like this is where like Phenonian Slips is the place where Black iconoclasm manifests as look how icons are operating in your psyche on every level. How you think about yourself, how you categorize somebody in that split second when you see them, how you envision your life purpose and your family and what you mean to your family. All of those things come out here. And this example outside of Spill is I'm like across the corner and I'm watching what's happening as this back in my cigarette smoking days. Nobody should smoke cigarettes. So, or like I'm out there, I'm watching this group outside and they're like in a circle and they're like, passing cigarettes and the lighter around. And this black woman sort of is waiting for, it looks like she's waiting for the bus. She's in slacks and like a puffy jacket, hair in a ponytail. Like there's nothing about her that seems more than just like working class, like leaving work perhaps, because it's like it's kind of late, like you're probably leaving work, leaving the hospital, like nothing stands out in particular. Walks up to this group, and the group is multiracial. There's like two black men, some white people, non-black, non-white people, and as she's walking up, to ask a question, one of the black men gets out in front of the rest of the group and basically says something to the effect of like, listen, I know things are rough right now, but like we ain't got it. And like there's this moment of like, and I double take, you know, and there's this like awkward like silence. Like it wasn't that long, but it was an impactful silence of like, and she's looking at him. She's like, "So none of y'all have cigarettes?" And then another like big pause, like a break in silence. Again, not maybe in time, but like just the severity of the like almost like, plates crashed or like the music stops in like a movie scene. And you can see that this guy's like he can't even like as he's recognizing what happened, he's stumped. He's stumped on how to respond. And that's when like another black man in the group like gets a cigarette from the other person, goes up, is like, here's this cigarette, like my bad. And like, she walks away and they kind of look at each other and they all know what just happened, right? They all seem like they're like, they're tipsy. Like I bet you that these people don't necessarily remember this moment, but I'm literally writing a chapter on Fanonian slips, and it's just like it's like some things just kind of like happen in life. You're like, is this happening, right? And like in that moment, it's just like on a base level, even trying to identify as a mutual smoker, even that attempt at mutual recognition is literally colored by racial lines. And it's like this black man does this to this black woman. And for me, I think he's doing it with a sort of good intention. That's what I want. I think it's best if we start from that generative position because it actually nuances it more to say, like, perhaps he's like, listen, they're not going to handle it as well as me. And I can sort of identify with you in terms of like, I know things are rough, right? But the idea that she's going to ask for it, and it can't be a lighter, it can't be a cigarette, it must be something more, it must be money or something like that, right? That assumption goes to like, yo, when you look in the mirror, what assumptions do you make about your own self, right? And so there's that moment of literally overlaid on that actual woman, whatever her name was, is an icon that is working in his psyche, that is overlaid onto his self, that he's slipping between. He's slipping between identifying with her and speaking on behalf of the group, which is symbolic of the white mask. And it relates to, as I say, the infamous scene of Black Skin, White Mask, right? The Mama Look a Negro, right? Where Fadon's on the train and he's accosted, and the white mother is like, chill, you're gonna make him angry. Look, he's very handsome. And he's like, the handsome Negro says, fuck you, madame, right? It's like this moment. And what's happening here, right, is that the child who's only seen black people through media and the iconography, right, overlays that icon onto this black man, right? As he perhaps expects the smiling face, the yes sir boss, please response from Fanon. He doesn't see him as a man, right? And of course, Fanon is narrating that he wanted to be seen as such as much as he could. And it's in this moment that he realizes that's not going to happen. And the mom is like, it sort of outs her, like the child is her slip. The child announces, like, look, my mom is teaching me racist things. Like, you know what I mean? Like in like, like it announces that this household is ingratiated in this language, this racial iconography. And his fuck you is to say, like, no, there isn't a recognition happening here. It is a violence, just as when she says, like, so none of y'all have cigarettes. It is a sort of like the tone in which she said it, as if like, so you don't have this, right? As if to try and get him to like, what were you thinking I was gonna ask for? It is a kind of fuck you. And the person doing it, he is the child and the mother in some sense. He's the slippage that announces something about the group, but he's also the mother trying to apologize preemptively almost for the group, and the slippage emerges there. Yeah.
This makes me think I just wanted to bring up an interesting related example. I believe this was in 2020. I saw it on Twitter amid the very superficial national conversations that were happening about anti-black racism at that time. It was really brought into the mainstream in profound ways. Someone, I believe, tweeted they were on the subway in New York, and there was a white mother and daughter sitting together, and the daughter, younger than 10, the daughter said to the mother, the daughter was crying and said to the mother, "Mommy, will I always be white?" And that was all that was all I remember from the anecdote. But I thought it was this very strange example of kind of like racial politics, and performed in a public setting where everyone could hear this. And I can't recall if there was like a response from the mother, but it was just a strange moment of kind of like public performance of racial politics, presumably a liberal mother and daughter. But yeah, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that example.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what I'm hearing is that this is a sort of like white liberal multicultural iteration of a slip,
Exactly.
in the sense that what it's announcing is a more fetishistic relationship to blackness, that sort of cool factor. I want to be in with the cool kids and get to inhabit and perform sort of things that I know that my whiteness, which I guess this child is internalizing a sort of feeling of guilt around, wants to move away from. But of course, it's one that is all about a sort of egotistical projection, right? There's like this
Exactly.
game that psychoanalysts talk about. Freud talks about it. It's actually about his like grandkid. It's like some game where you like, it's like this stick, and like it's like a stick and it holds this ball, and you try to like balance it on the thing. But it's not about the ball coming or going, right? It's about being able to actually control it generally. And so there's a similar thing that I think is happening there. It's like I want to have the jouissance basically of participating in the like the sort of racial performance of the multicultural era. Yeah,
With
that's
none of the
generally what I
stakes or
think.
consequences, obviously, right?
Right, right. That's what I think is sort of. It almost reminds me of Saidiya Hartman's commentary on John Rankin, the abolitionist, who imagines himself and his family in the position of brutalized enslaved people to have empathy with them. And Hartman talks about how that, like that, rhetorically placing yourself in those shoes, what it means is like you can't actually have sympathy for the enslaved person. It is only an empathy when you project yourself into it, erasing them from their very shoes. A similar thing seems to be undergirding this thing, because I mean that could very much turn into the like ressentiment of, well, since I can't be it and I'm positioned as this negative thing, well, actually I'm tired of this thing that is constantly demonizing me, and like I'm tired of that being the cool thing. So that could transform into a 16-year-old who's very much like resentful of DEI and all of those things because they weren't allowed to inhabit that position.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're illustrating here in real time why your why this theory that you're setting up in this book actually has like a lot of generative potential for, as you say, not just, kind of this black iconoclasm as the practice of black radical discernment, right? That it is something that, you're coming to an awareness of something that is always kind of undergirding rhetoric and discourse, but it's also something that I think just generatively is about moving our sort of epistemological priors away from that settled notion of, whether it's sort of positive or negative iconography of race in general. But I think just for the sake of time, it might be good for us to wrap up here as well. And we wanted to finish off with a question that I think points to another real strong uniqueness in your book, which is you have this tripartite allegorical narrative that you've written, Black Icarus parts 1 through 3. Could you tell us what was the inspiration for this choice to intersperse some of your chapters with this allegorical creative narrative, and how does that relate to your broader arguments about Black iconoclasm?
Yeah, so just as I grew up with racial iconography, I took Greek classes. Like I'm fluent in modern Greek, reading, writing, the whole bit. I lived in Athens for like a year or so here and there. Part of what I did in these classes is like there was times where like they would just show us like the animated versions of Greek myths, like literally just like teaching them to us. And like till this day, I have like random, like almost encyclopedic knowledge of random Greek myths. Like I like to tinker with them in my mind. I even when I was teaching this a rhetoric course in Com, part of what we would do in the language chapter with semiotics and myths is I would have students remix myths to produce new meanings. So that's just a thing that I've always done pedagogically. Like some people would remix Rapunzel, and it's like a feminist story where she uses her hair to like choke out aggressors, right? Stuff like that
That's a,
happens,
that's a
right?
cool assignment,
Um,
though. I really like that.
yeah. And so there's that. Then I actually was reading in grad school. Lou Mirage had given me this newly translated work, Alienation and Freedom, which is like a collection of Fanon's like medical dissertation and like two of the three plays that he wrote. One of them is Lost, which like they're like are kind of like doing this like ancient Greek thing going on in it. So I was inspired by that, and also was inspired by the sort of like aphoristic like style of a like Nietzsche or Glissant. And I also, to be quite honest, and this is something that I'm still working on as a separate thing, the end of Rhetoric of Religion by Burke has this sort of staged, it's from the Old Testament, and it's thinking, when Lucifer is positioned on the council in heaven, right, as this trickster working with God, right, to sort of test Job, right, to see if he will keep his faith or not. And actually, a lot of people don't realize that Job does renounce his faith. And there is that moment where, against all of his friends pleading with him, he's like, fuck this shit, right? And so that way that he staged that, all of those things were in my mind when I came to this. And I don't know, I think I was sitting there and talking to my partner one day, and like it just kind of like it just like came up almost like a moment of eureka, kind of like Black Icarus. And the way that I view it is I'm sort of disordering, I'm tinkering with this genre of ancient Greek myth, its own kind of cultural vocabulary or iconography. It's also, of course, religious, right? I guess it's like ancient Greek religious practices. And then, of course, I said I was inspired by Hartman's idea of critical fabulation, right? Of reimagining a sort of story or events, jeopardizing the main event, and actually non-human characters. And so I purposely withhold the event of Icarus's death, and I'm performing the style of in media res in the middle of things, right? Where it's not the actual death that matters, but everything that's leading up. And I'm trying to say that the message that we've received, that it's about not flying too high or too low, is actually the wrong message. It's actually that we cannot build our path to freedom from the same conceptual materials as the labyrinth, right? So Icarus's flight was doomed from the beginning because Daedalus, the man who created the labyrinth for Minos before being imprisoned in it, and Icarus, his father, who is married to an enslaved woman in the story, like he builds the wings from the same conceptual and material resources of the labyrinth, right? So it changes, like, quite literally the story. So in part one, you see Daedalus and Icarus trying to leave. You get some context about his backstory. I purposely don't use names, and I purposely strip it of the ancient Greek context and use things like father and son and all of that, because these characters are acting as philosophical perspectives. And I wanted it to not seem so ingrained in Greek culture, but I'm adjusting it as almost a parable to think about anti-blackness and the anti-black world as a labyrinth. So it's sort of fantastical in that way. And there's this power struggle between Minos and Daedalus as the background. They're both struggling to be the more dominant figure. As I imagine it, there's perhaps questions about Icarus's lineage, who is his actual father, right? Because you don't get to consent to sexual activity as an enslaved person. And in the actual myth, there is a background that Daedalus gets jealous of his own nephew in Athens and pushes him off of the Acropolis. And that jealousy is what lands him in Crete in the first place. So Daedalus is this arrogant figure, right? It's all about his glory, and the king gets mad that he thinks he's more glorious than the king. Daedalus thinks he's more glorious than the gods, right? And his wife then becomes another philosophical perspective. This is also paralleling Fanon, who positions women characters in his plays as cautioning of the masculinism and heroism of the figures in his plays. And so his deceased wife and the deceased mother of Icarus serve as that. It also is literally a gesture to lose your mother, the loss of one's mother, natal alienation, and the imposition of the white father, right? And she's the warning that sort of is parroting this discourse that is very reminiscent of Audre Lorde, right? The master's tools will not destroy the master's house. So he tries to find this exit he's built into the labyrinth, but it all looks the same. All right. And so he finds himself stuck there. And even the pigeons that Daedalus interacts with in that scene, they're symbolic here of the mother, of the warning, of freedom, of that being which is seen as nasty relative to the pure white dove that we see in a lot of, like, the Holy Spirit is usually depicted as a dove is coming along with it, right? And so you kind of get this idea of like they're gonna have this flight towards freedom, but there's concerns and the death is impending. The second one moves us to, it's before that scene, right? But it's after the death of his mother. And really what I'm trying to comment on here is blackness as a phobogenic object, playing on the Minotaur, who goes unnamed. To think that projections about blackness and like the thing that animates the anxieties around the entire labyrinth and how the society operates, which is a nod to the space traders, a nod to those who walked away from Omelas, I believe is what the title is. It's also, to be honest, I was thinking about Zakiya Jackson's cover of Becoming Human, which is a sort of like part human, like Minotaur looking black woman figure, which is from a particular artist, if I remember correctly. And so really it's like all of these projections on the Minotaur and the justification for the labyrinth and the justification for slavery become evident as being intricate and connected here, in the sense that, so that whole issue with the head doctor and the woman who's having the sort of like fantasy, that is literally a remix of a like mental, like psychiatric report that Fanon has of one of his patients, Mill B, who has these like fantasies of like black men like coming to like assault her but enjoying the fantasy of it. And it's like this really weird sort of like he sort of, this is where he's using psychoanalysis to think about the way that like sort of sexuality and blackness are tied together, that fear itself is a kind of desire in some sense, right? And so that's what I'm using here. And so the whole like three circles and the Minotaur, all of that kind of comes together. And there's this moment where, she sort of says like, it kind of looked like you, right? Almost blurring that moment where, is Icarus the Minotaur beast? Is he? And I want to leave that open for interpretation. Is he? Is he the one that they're all afraid of? Is he not? Is the enslaved population represented as closer to the Minotaur? Is the Minotaur the mixed offspring of an enslaved person and a master? Like, is it fears of miscegenation? Like, it's supposed to be open to interpretation. And so then the third one moves past the death scene to the grief of Daedalus, right? And it's Daedalus trying to bring back his son and his wife through perfect molds of icons and statues. So in actual Greek myth, Daedalus is known as creating such realistic objects that they were thought to come to life because the gods would breathe life into them. And I sort of play on that in the first scene where he laughs with Icarus about like, they thought the gods breathed life into them. But in fact, in the third one, I want to call that into question, and it's sort of like, did he have a secret from the gods? Did he betray it and that's why he's lost it? Or was it all actually a joke and he's gone crazy from his grief trying to do a thing that he knows won't work? And so he's unable to come to grips with the reasons why his son died, why his wife died. He dies as he's struck by a snake, the snake being symbolic of the cycle of samsara for me. But actually, in the Greek myth, he does get bit by a snake and die in that way. And so, he dies, and that final quote that I have, I see, again, is actually taken from one of Fanon's plays, the second one called The Parallel Hands, which is a remix of an Oedipus complex where this revolutionary deposes the king and then realizes that his hands are parallel to the king because of the sort of like iconographic, heroic, masculine perspective he propped himself into that the women in the play tell him not to do. So there's that moment, right, of I see, like, I doomed you from the beginning because I literally I show that he builds the wings from things that are in the labyrinth, literally, but also it's the same mentality that he built the prison with, right? So all of it is a cautionary parable about conceptualizing black flight or a blackened world from the same conceptual resources of the anti-black world. It's a push to that negative theology. We don't have the answer. If you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha. It's that sort of oomph. Yeah.
This is why I talk about your book having what I would only describe as a conceptual elegance, which is just to say that the way that you're able to weave a literary conceit like that into a book that has such a, all these nuanced connections between Fanon, between Edouard Glissant, and like all of these other theorists that you're in conversation with. I don't really have anything else to say other than just thank you for kind of setting a standard for what scholarship and rhetoric can be. Because like I said, I had a lot of fun reading this book. Actually, I mean, it was challenging to the way that I think in so many ways as well.
There's a whole chapter about movies that we didn't even cover.
Oh, my
which is
God,
really
yeah,
interesting and really fun.
Yeah, this
really
would have been a
as well.
3-hour conversation if we had gone into that chapter.
Absolutely. But thank you so much, Charles, for being here.
I really appreciate it, and you kind of like write it and you don't know how it's going to be received, so I appreciate the comments. I'm sort of working on the second project now that's like thinking more with Edouard Glissant than Fanon. So I kind of tipped my hand with the last chapter of the book being more Glissantian.
Right.
Yeah.
So like Glissant has some lines about Roma people being nomadic and errant. And he has this line about how the archipelagos of the Antilles, the Caribbean, and the archipelago of the Mediterranean should meet. So like and he has this whole line about the world is becoming an archipelago, the world is creolizing. So the next project, which is going to take me, like probably 3 years, from now, I'm going to take some time with it. I'm traveling to Puerto Rico this summer. I'm going to go to Greece next summer. It's going to be a project that like traverses PR, continental US, Greece. I don't know where it'll go from there, but really trying to think that concept. So as almost like a different performance or extension of Black iconoclasm. So, that's to say that even my own work is like evolving and kind of extending some of these conversations in the second book, and also more transnational in perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really cool getting to talk to you about your craft a little bit too, just in sort of like where your ideas come from, what serves as your inspiration. I mean, that in general is just, I mean, I think for even if you're not a rhetoric scholar or a specialist in this listening, I mean, this is just really, really incredible to kind of hear about that kind of process of ideation. You can really see it on display in your writing a lot. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's always a tough needle to thread, to interweave your own personal experience and your own background into your work like that. But I mean, you do it with a lot of grace. So I really commend you for that, Charles. And yeah, thanks for sharing your work with us. And it's been great having you on the show with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I hope you all have a nice rest of your evening. And again, thank you for the opportunity.
Well, and thank you to all of our listeners as well. For all of you listening out there, we hope you enjoyed this conversation. We'll be coming at you with more Reverb soon. But until then, take care, everybody, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Our show today was produced by Alex Helberg and Calvin Pollock, with editing work by Calvin and editorial assistance from Alex. Reverb's co-producers at large are Ben Williams, Sophie Wadzak, and Olivia Burnett. You can subscribe to Reverb and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Android, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out our website at www.reverbcast.com. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ReverbCast. That's REVERB_CAST. If you've enjoyed our show and want to help amplify more of our public scholarship work, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. And tell a friend about us. We sincerely appreciate the support of our listeners. Thanks so much for tuning in.